The laughter came easy in Redemption Flats. It always did when a man made a fool of himself in public. And Thomas Aldridge had made the grandest kind of fool of himself. The kind that costs everything a man owns and leaves him standing in the dust with nothing but a deed to land that would surely kill him. It was the spring of 1874 when Thomas rode into town on a rust-colored roan horse, a lean man of about 35, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the collar, sharp green eyes that seemed to be measuring everything they touched, and a jaw that carried the quiet stubbornness of a man who had learned early in life that nobody was going to hand him anything. He wore a plain canvas duster the color of old wheat, a brown felt hat with a slightly bent brim, a simple gun belt with a single Colt revolver holstered low on his right hip, and boots that had seen enough trail to know when the road got rough. He wasn't a big man, but there was something in the way he sat the saddle, straight-backed and deliberate, that made people look twice before they looked away. He went straight to the land office, asked for everything that was available in the valley northeast of town, and walked out 40 minutes later with a deed to 320 acres of ground that the previous owner, a cattle rancher named Holt, had abandoned so fast he'd left his fence posts in the ground. The land sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, fed by a creek that ran year-round, and bordered on the north and east by territory that the Sioux considered their own. 3 ranchers and a store owner watched Thomas ride northeast out of Redemption Flats that afternoon. And before his dust had settled, the laughing started. "Man's bought himself a graveyard," said Calvin Pierce, who ran the feed store and considered himself the authority on most things within 20 miles. He was a wide man, florid-faced, with a gray-streaked mustache he kept waxed at the tips, and he said it loud enough that the 4 men standing near the hitching post all heard it and laughed accordingly. "Sioux been running cattle off that land for 2 years. Holt lost 16 head and his best hand before he had enough sense to quit." "Maybe the stranger's got a death wish," offered young Danny Coles, who was 19 and thought most things were funnier than they turned out to be. Nobody disagreed. They watched the dust settle and went back to their business, and the laughter faded the way laughter does when there's nothing left to feed it. Thomas Aldridge and his questionable purchase faded from the immediate conversation, replaced by more pressing concerns. The drought, the price of beef, the rumor that the railroad might push a spur line through the county. 3 weeks passed without word from the Northeast Valley. Then 6 weeks. Then 2 months. Calvin Pierce remarked once that the stranger had probably been dead for a month already, and nobody had thought to go check. The marshal, a weathered man named Garrett Foss, who had a habit of tilting his head slightly to the right when he was thinking hard about something, said he'd ride out that direction when he got the chance, but he never seemed to find the chance, and the matter rested there, suspended in the particular indifference of small western towns. It was late July when Thomas Aldridge rode back into Redemption Flats, and he did not look like a dead man. He looked, in fact, considerably better than he had in May. His roan horse was well fed and rested, his duster had been cleaned, and he carried himself with the particular quality of a man who has recently proven something to himself. He tied up at the general store, bought a list of supplies that included rope, several iron pipes, 2 lengths of canvas tubing, a considerable quantity of lamp oil, and 3 good surveyor's stakes, paid cash for all of it, loaded it on a pack mule he'd brought along, and was preparing to leave when Calvin Pierce ambled over from the feed store with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets. "Didn't kill you yet," Pierce said in the tone of a man who considered this mildly surprising. "Not yet," Thomas agreed pleasantly. "Sioux give you trouble?" Thomas looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to be doing arithmetic behind them. "Some," he said. "We worked it out." Pierce laughed at that, a short bark of a laugh. "Worked it out? That's rich. You speak Lakota now, do you?" "Enough," Thomas said, and climbed up on his roan. Pierce watched him ride northeast again, shook his head, and went back to the feed store. The laughter that afternoon was smaller than before, not because the situation seemed less funny, but because there was something in the way Thomas Aldridge said the word enough that sat uncomfortably in a man's chest and didn't move easy. If you enjoyed the beginning of this story, consider subscribing to the channel. There is much more of this tale to tell, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The story of what Thomas Aldridge had worked out with the Sioux and what he had found on his 320 acres did not come out all at once. It came out the way most important things come out in the West, in pieces, through intermediaries, carried by the particular current of rumor that runs through small towns like an underground river. The first piece arrived in the form of a Lakota man named Running Elk, who appeared at the southern edge of Redemption Flats one morning in late August, leading a good horse and carrying nothing that looked like a weapon. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, his black hair worn loose, dressed in a combination of traditional and trade clothing that marked him as someone comfortable moving between two worlds. He went directly to the marshal's office, which surprised Garrett Foss considerably, and asked, in English that was rough but functional, whether Marshal Foss knew a man called Aldridge. Foss said he did, after a fashion. Running Elk said that Aldridge had asked him to deliver a message. The Northeast Valley was not available for cattle grazing by anyone in Redemption Flats, not this season or any other, and any cattle found on that land would be driven back to wherever they came from. He said this without hostility, in a flat, declarative tone, and then he left. Foss chewed on that for a while, then rode out to find Thomas. He found him at the Northeast Valley, and what he found there stopped him at the crest of the southern ridgeline for a long moment before he rode down. Thomas was there, and he was not alone. There were 3 Lakota men working alongside him, not watching, not standing guard, but actually working, helping to drive what appeared to be a series of iron-cased pipe sections into the earth along the east side of the property. They had already completed at least half a dozen such installations, each capped with a hand pump and connected by a series of trenches that someone had lined with flat river stone. Foss rode down slowly, watching his hands and keeping his face neutral. Thomas looked up when he heard the hooves, pushed his hat back, and nodded. "Marshal, Aldridge." Foss looked at the pipework. "What exactly are you building here?" "Water system," Thomas said. "Spring-fed artesian wells, 3 of them, plus a gravity flow distribution line." He said it simply, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, which it was absolutely not. Artesian well systems in this country in 1874 were expensive, technically demanding, and generally associated with either railroad companies or men of substantial means. A lone homesteader installing one on disputed borderland territory while working alongside Lakota men was not a thing Garrett Foss had encountered in his considerable experience.
"Where'd you learn to do that?" Foss asked. "Pennsylvania mining country," Thomas said. "My father worked the mines. We had springs everywhere, and if you didn't learn to move water, you didn't work." Foss looked at the Lakota men. One of them, the youngest, met his gaze with a neutral expression, and then went back to work. "Running Elk came to town," Foss said. "Delivered a message about grazing rights." "That's right," Thomas said. "You're aware that telling the cattlemen of this county where they can and can't graze is going to make you considerably unpopular." "I was unpopular when I bought the land," Thomas said. "Doesn't seem to have slowed anything down." Foss almost smiled at that. Almost. He was a man who had learned to keep his reactions to himself, which was a useful quality in a marshal, and a somewhat lonely one in a human being. He looked around the valley, the year-round creek running clear and cold, the good grass, the timber on the north ridge, the 3 solid artesian installations with their stone-lined distribution trenches. And he began, in the methodical way his mind worked, to understand what Thomas Aldrich was building here. It wasn't just a homestead. It was a water system, a permanent, engineered, treaty-adjacent water system on land that happened to sit at the junction of white settlement territory and Sioux traditional range, built cooperatively by a white man from Pennsylvania mining country and Lakota men who presumably had their own reasons for the arrangement. "How deep are those wells?" Foss asked. "Deepest one's 42 feet, Thomas said. It's a sandstone aquifer. The water pressure is strong enough to run a 3-inch pipe 200 yards by gravity alone. That's a considerable amount of water." "This is a considerable amount of dry country," Thomas said. Foss rode back to Redemption Flats and said nothing specific to anyone,
which was itself a kind of communication that the men of the town knew how to read. Calvin Pierce asked him directly what he'd found out there, and Foss said, "Homesteading." And Pierce snorted, and Foss went into his office and closed the door. The second piece of the story arrived in September, and it was considerably more consequential. A man named Dalton Hurst rode into Redemption Flats from the east, representing a land and cattle consortium out of Cheyenne that had been quietly acquiring grazing rights across the territory for 2 years. Hurst was a precise, well-dressed man of about 50, with silver hair, and the kind of smooth, even manner that comes from long practice at delivering unwelcome news to people who couldn't do much about it. He had papers, he had money, and he had a clear sense of what he wanted, which was access to the Northeast Valley and the year-round creek that ran through it. He went first to the land office, learned that the property was validly deeded to one Thomas Aldrich, and spent a day and a half making quiet inquiries around town about the man. What he heard amused him. A loner, a drifter of some kind, Pennsylvania background, no visible resources, had bought land on the Sioux borderland that everyone agreed was worthless. Hurst decided the matter would be straightforward. He offered fair market value for the land, which was, admittedly, not a great deal, added 20% to that as a gesture of goodwill, and rode northeast to find Aldrich and close the deal. He did not close the deal. What exactly passed between Dalton Hurst and Thomas Aldrich in the Northeast Valley that September afternoon was never fully reported. But Hurst came back to Redemption Flats 3 hours later, wearing a different expression than the one he'd left with. Something tight around the eyes and mouth that replaced the smooth professional ease. He had dinner at the hotel, said almost nothing to anyone,
and left the following morning without explaining himself. Calvin Pierce tried to get the story out of the hotel owner, a woman named Margaret Dowd, who missed very little and was generally willing to share what she knew with select parties. But Margaret said only that Mr. Hurst had eaten his supper, drunk his whiskey, and seemed like a man who had gone out expecting to buy a horse and come back having been told the horse could talk. The laughter that evening around the stove at Pierce's feed store was slightly nervous around the edges. October brought a development no one in Redemption Flats was quite prepared for. A small delegation arrived from the north, 3 Lakota elders accompanied by running elk, and behind them, Thomas Aldrich on his bay horse. They came to the marshal's office not as a confrontation, but as an announcement, with Garrett Foss as witness. The Northeast Valley, Thomas explained, was the site of a water cooperative arrangement. He had built the artesian well system. The Lakota had contributed labor, local knowledge, and an agreement not to disturb the homestead.
In exchange, the water system served both communities. The arrangement had been formalized in a document Thomas had drafted, Running Elk had translated, and 3 elders had marked with their signs. It was not a legal treaty in any government sense, but it was a genuine agreement between 2 parties who each had something the other needed, made in the way the best arrangements in the West were always made, not through courts, but through the direct negotiation of people who had to live with the consequences. Foss read the document, asked 2 questions, and filed it in his office. Pierce and 4 other men watched from across the street with expressions that had traveled some distance from laughter and hadn't quite arrived anywhere comfortable. It was the first week of November when the ground gave up its real secret. Thomas had been extending the distribution trench system, digging along the west side of the property to run water to a small structure he was building, a combination barn and workshop, when his shovel hit something that rang with a tone that stopped him cold. He knelt down, cleared the earth with his hands, and found the edge of a vein of copper ore so rich and so close to the surface that for a moment he simply sat there in the November cold, his hands in the dirt, looking at it. He understood immediately what it meant, and he understood equally immediately that it had to be handled correctly, because handled incorrectly, it would destroy everything he'd built. He did not go to town. He went north. He found Running Elk and told him what he'd found, directly and without evasion, because Running Elk and the elders had a stake in this land by the terms of their agreement, and because Thomas Aldridge was not a man who believed that good arrangements survived dishonesty. He laid out the extent of the vein, substantial copper, possibly silver-bearing, running at least 200 yards along the west edge of the property, and what it would mean if outside men learned of it before the 2 parties had decided together what to do. Running Elk was quiet for a long time. Then he said the elders would need to be consulted. The consultation took 4 days. On the 5th day, Running Elk came back with 2 elders, and the 4 of them sat in Thomas's small cabin beside the iron stove and talked the thing through. The elders were practical men. They had watched hills stripped and carried away across the territory and understood that what lay underground was both a resource and a threat. They did not claim the copper was sacred. They claimed it was valuable, and that its value could serve their people if the arrangement was right. Thomas proposed a formal mining partnership. He held the legal claim and had the mining knowledge. A cousin in Pennsylvania ran a small equipment operation, and a Cheyenne bank knew his name favorably. The Lakota held something equally valuable: the political reality that no outside operation would function in this valley without their cooperation. A form of leverage geography enforced regardless of what any law said. The elders asked for 1/3 of production revenue, priority employment for their men, and a guarantee the water system would be maintained. Thomas countered with 28% initially, moving to 33% after the first year of profitable operation, and accepted the rest without modification. They shook hands, the old way, grip to forearm, and the arrangement was made. Thomas Aldridge rode into Redemption Flats in the 3rd week of November with a document drawn up at the land office in Cheyenne, a letter of credit from his banker, and a calm, settled expression that struck Calvin Pierce when he saw it as the expression of a man who no longer had anything to prove to anyone in this town. Pierce found out about the copper from the land office clerk before Thomas had been in town 2 hours. The clerk's name was Warren, a young man with prominent ears and a notable inability to keep information to himself, and he was across the street at the feed store before the ink was dry, whispering with the particular urgency of a man who has stumbled onto something significant. Pierce listened. Then he walked out of his own store and directly to the hotel, where Thomas was eating lunch, and sat down across from him without being invited. Heard you filed a mining claim, Pierce said. I did, Thomas said, cutting his meat. Copper. Among other things. Pierce was quiet for a moment. His waxed mustache twitched slightly. That land, I said, was worthless. You did say that, Thomas agreed pleasantly. Man could look foolish. Man could, Thomas said. He set his fork down and looked at Pierce with those green, measuring eyes. You laughed at me when I bought that deed. That's all right. You didn't know what I knew.
But I want to be clear about something, Calvin. The water system in that valley serves the Lakota as much as it serves my operation. The mining arrangement does the same. If anyone in this town decides to challenge my deed, pressure the land office, or tip off that Cheyenne consortium, anything that threatens what I've built out there, they'll find the Lakota elders considerably less patient with that kind of interference than with a man who comes to them honestly. That's not a threat. That's just the shape of things. He finished his lunch, paid Margaret Dowd, nodded to Pierce, and left. Pierce sat at the table for a while after Thomas was gone. Margaret came by to clear the dishes and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many things and found most of them unsurprising. Well, she said. Well, Pierce agreed. December came hard, the way December came in Wyoming, with cold that had edges to it and snow that the wind drove sideways across the flats. The Northeast Valley was sheltered somewhat by its ridgelines, and the year-round creek kept running under a skin of ice, and the artesian wells pushed water up warm from the deep sandstone, even when the air was brutal. Thomas worked the cabin tight and spent the coldest weeks with his surveying equipment, mapping the full extent of the copper vein, which turned out to be considerably more substantial than his first estimate. His cousin from Pennsylvania arrived in January with 2 experienced miners and a mule team carrying equipment. Running Elk sent 2 of his younger men to work alongside them, and by February they had a modest, carefully engineered extraction operation running. The first load of copper ore left the Northeast Valley on a Tuesday in March 1875, loaded onto a freight wagon and covered with canvas, driven by Thomas himself, with Running Elk riding alongside toward the rail junction. They attracted no attention, which was precisely the intention. Thomas had learned from his father's experience in the mines that the time to be quiet about what you had was while you were still building it into something solid, before the lawyers and investors and men with large money and small consciences arrived to negotiate their share. In Redemption Flats that spring, the laughter had been gone for some time. What replaced it was a quieter feeling, a mixture of chagrin and reluctant respect, and the discomfort of people who have been publicly wrong about something consequential. Calvin Pierce said very little, which for Pierce was a statement in itself. The townspeople watched the freight wagon pass through on its way to the rail junction, noted the Lakota man riding beside the driver, noted the canvas-covered cargo, and did the arithmetic. Most arrived at the right answer. A few found occasion to say to Thomas, when they encountered him in town, something along the lines of, "Glad things worked out," which is the Western approximation of an apology, and was offered and received in that spirit. By the summer of 1875, the Northeast Valley had a proper name. People called it Aldridge Valley on maps, though Thomas himself always called it the Valley, as though its proper name was still a work in progress. The mining operation was producing at a rate his Cheyenne banker described as substantially above initial projections. The Lakota families who wintered at the north end of the valley were, by Running Elk's account, in better condition than they had been in years. Consistent water, employment income, and the stability that comes from a reliable arrangement with neighbors who keep their word. Garrett Foss rode out to the valley on a July afternoon to see the thing for himself. He found Thomas at the mine entrance with 2 of Running Elk's men, reviewing extraction numbers, and was struck again by the image that had stopped him at the ridgeline 2 summers ago. White man and Lakota men
working side by side, not in the tense way of a forced arrangement, but in the easy, competent way of people who have learned each other's methods. He had coffee with Thomas on the cabin porch, watching the valley in the afternoon light. The creek ran clear. A garden grew along its east bank. The mine entrance was tidy, properly timbered. "You planned all this from the beginning," Foss said. "Not all of it," Thomas said honestly. "I didn't know about the copper when I bought the deed. I knew about the water. I'd studied the geology for 6 months before I came out here. The sandstone aquifer runs through this whole region, but the Northeast Valley is one of the best access points. A man who controls reliable water in dry country controls a great deal more than water." "The Sioux connection." "Not a problem," Thomas said. "A condition. I knew any operation on borderland territory that didn't account for the Lakota interest would fail, probably violently. So I went north first, before I filed the deed, before I broke ground, before I did anything. Spent 2 weeks listening." "And the copper?" "Gift from the ground," Thomas said. "I'd have built the water system and called it enough. Copper is the kind of thing that either ruins you or sets you up, depending entirely on how you handle it when it arrives." Foss drank his coffee and thought about what a man has to be: patient, honest, technically competent, politically realistic, to build what Thomas had built from almost nothing. He thought about Pierce's laughter and his own failure to ride out and check when he'd had the chance. "I should have come out sooner," Foss said. "You came when you needed to," Thomas said. "That's mostly how it works." There was a silence between them, the comfortable kind that settles between men who understand each other. And then Running Elk appeared at the top of the South Ridge on his horse, raised a hand in greeting,
and rode down into the valley with the easy authority of a man returning to somewhere he belongs.
Thomas raised a hand back. Foss did the same. The laughter from Redemption Flats had died so thoroughly by then that nobody in town could quite remember the specific shape of it, the exact words Pierce had used, the exact tone of Danny Coles's young voice making his joke about death wishes. What remained instead was the fact of the valley. The water running year-round, the mine operating quietly and profitably, the cooperative arrangement between a Pennsylvania miner's son and a Lakota community that everyone had assumed would destroy each other, standing as solid proof that the West contained possibilities that small imaginations consistently failed to see. Thomas Aldridge had bought land surrounded by the Sioux because he had done his homework, because he had enough respect for the people around him to come to them honestly before he came with anything else, and because he had understood something that the men laughing on the porch at Pierce's feed store had not, that the things most people call obstacles are frequently the most valuable elements of any situation, if you're willing to look at them directly and ask what they actually need. The copper went on producing for 11 years. The water system, expanded twice, served the valley through droughts that broke neighboring operations entirely. The arrangement survived 3 changes of federal Indian policy and 2 attempts by outside mining consortiums to challenge the claim. Running Elk eventually hired a lawyer of his own, a sharp young man from St. Louis, who found in the Northeast Valley's cooperative arrangement something genuinely worth defending, and no challenge ever succeeded. Calvin Pierce lived to see all of it. He never again laughed at a man for buying land that everyone else had decided was worthless. He told the story in his later years, accurately and without flattering himself,
including the part about his certainty that Thomas Aldridge was buying a graveyard. He told it as a lesson, which is the best use any man can make of the times he has been wrong. The valley kept its water, the ridge kept its quiet, and Thomas Aldridge, who had ridden into Redemption Flats on a rust-colored roan with a deed to 320 acres that no one else had wanted,
built something in that dry and borderland country that outlasted most of the arguments about whether it could exist at all. In the West, as in most places, the men who build lasting things are rarely the men who laugh the loudest at the beginning. They are the men who go quiet, who study the land, who speak honestly to their neighbors, and who understand that what is underground, water, copper, or the deep, patient possibility of genuine cooperation between people who have reason to distrust each other, is almost always more valuable than what anyone can see from the surface. Thomas knew that from the start. The valley proved it. And Redemption Flats, for all its early laughter, was wise enough eventually to understand what it had witnessed. Not luck, not stubbornness alone, but the rarest and most durable kind of intelligence. The kind that sees clearly past what everyone else has already decided to believe. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every story here is told with that same honesty, and the best tales from the Old West are always the ones where the dust settles to reveal something worth keeping. The Northeast Valley, Aldridge Territory, Lakota Partnership, water permanent, copper deep, laughter gone, and in its place something better, something that held through dry years and hard winters, and all the difficult, necessary work of building a life in a land that never promised anything easy to anyone. That was the West. That was the truth of it. And that, in the end, was enough.